Hello, and welcome to the Klassiki Podcast. I'm your host, Sam Goff. Klassiki is your one-stop shop for the wide world of cinema from Eastern Europe. Subscribers gain access to our ever-evolving library of classic and contemporary films, as well as access to filmmaker interviews, video introductions, program notes, essays, watch lists, and more. You can sign up for a 7-day free trial today at klassiki.online. Today, I'll be taking a tour through the history of Eastern Europe's cult film with Dan Bird. Dan Bird is a writer, curator, archivist, and a filmmaker, and one of the world's leading specialists on cult cinema from Eastern Europe. Through his work in restoration, retrospectives, biography, and distribution, Dan has championed countless films from the region and has played a key role in preserving the legacies of iconic figures like Valerian Borowczyk, Sergei Parajanov, and in particular the Polish maestro Andrzej Żuławski, with whom he worked closely for several years. I spoke with Dan about his unusual path into Eastern European film, his experiences working alongside Żuławski, and what the colourful life of Sergei Parajanov can teach us about national identity and post-colonial film today. Many of the films we discuss are available to watch now on Klassiki, so make sure to check out the links in the show description. Dan, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you very much, Sam, for inviting me to be part of the Klassiki Podcast.
You're very welcome. So let's go back to the beginning, or some version of the beginning. So you grew up in England, in Staffordshire, in the 80s. So what was your entry point into the weird and wonderful world of Eastern European film? How did that bug first implant itself in a young Daniel Bird?
Well, I would say it was 2 points. The first was television. Television was during the 1980s where you would encounter world cinema. And in the early 90s, there were 2 series on Channel 4. One was a band season, and there was another series called Midnight Underground. And the band season, as the name implies, had a series of films which were banned. And one of those films was WR, Mysteries of the Organism by Dusan Makovejev. And I take that film. My parents were teachers, and we had this Betamax recorder because Betamax was deemed the more professional, and it is a technically superior standard. So there was like a tape recorder for recording things for lessons in schools, and I thought, I'm going to take this. It sounds utterly filthy from the description in the Radio Times. And it was filthy, but it was also really interesting because it was about Stalin, it was about Mao, it was about psychoanalysis, radical psychoanalysis, Wilhelm Reich, and Betty Dodson, and Jackie Curtis, and the Fugs. And it had this amazing collage style, which was a mixture of documentary and film. And to this day, I think it's a film I come back to all the time. On top of that, there was a film theatre in Stoke-on-Trent, which was programmed by Peter Hames, who has for many years been the Eastern European film advisor to the London Film Festival. So there was a very strong focus on Eastern European cinema in the programming. He wrote a book on the Czechoslovak New Wave. And so yeah, I think it was those 2 things, television and also the local film theatre.
So you've mentioned already we're into Yugoslav stuff, kind of black wave era Yugoslav stuff. There, the Czech New Wave you mentioned. So what are some other names then as you kind of move to university, kind of start to immerse yourself more? Who are the big names that really start to kind of form your personal canon?
It was primarily Borowczyk, particularly those early short films and his early feature films, Blanche, Goto, and Andrzej Żuławski. At the time, there was this cult around the video nasties, and of course, like any teenager, you want to see things which you're not allowed to see. And there was this film, Possession, and it had been on the list and taken off the list, but it was not available on video, and it was never screened on TV. So I managed to get a copy, and that film really it affected me in a way that it seemed very, very. It was really, to all intents and purposes, a horror film, but it was treated like a Bergman film. And at that particular moment in time, the film seemed to upset everybody. It was too vulgar for the kind of the art crowd, and too pretentious for the horror crowd. And I thought, well, this is my film. This is me. and so yeah, I think at that particular moment, I never thought of having an interest in Eastern Europe. I was interested in cinema. It just so happened that the filmmakers I was interested in were coming from Eastern Europe. Both Żuławski and Borowczyk, yes, they were Polish, but they were Polish emigre filmmakers. So, Borowczyk was working mainly in France, as was Żuławski. Possession was shot in West Berlin. Makovejev was also an exile filmmaker, a WR. Obviously, after he got banned, he spent much of his career. So I always, it felt like the Wild Bunch to me. All of these filmmakers who had committed these moral transgressions, or maybe not moral transgressions, but transgressions against cinema etiquette in the 60s and 70s, who, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the disintegration of the Eastern Bloc, was sort of drifting in this kind of capitalist landscape of the West, and were kind of forgotten.
Well, you've mentioned them already several times, so let's get into them. These Polish filmmakers with whom you're particularly associated, Żuławski and Borowczyk. Let's start with Andrzej Żuławski, a real kind of cult hero, not just in Eastern European cinema, but more broadly, director of On the Silver Globe and Possession, and someone who you worked with closely, had a personal relationship with in the last years of his life. So tell us a little bit about how you came to Żuławski and how Żuławski came to you.
In the case of Żuławski, I went to Paris to interview him. He hadn't been interviewed in English, for a very long time, maybe not at all, since the early 1980s. So, I went and we had this very long interview with Żuławski, and he made a big impression on me. And when we published the interview, I sort of thought, well, people aren't going to know the films we're talking about, so it makes sense to screen some of the films so that people can make sense of what we published. So I organized it was a weekend with Andrzej Żuławski. I went to the Polish embassy, and they said, well, we don't have a cinema. So I went to the French Institute, and they said, well, we do have a cinema, and most of these films are French, so we'll support it. So he came across. They screened his last Polish film without subtitles. There was practically a riot on the first evening amongst the Polish emigres who turned up because they were so upset. I thought it was fantastic. And then the following year, I sort of mentioned to him that I'd like to go to Poland to study film, and he said, "Don't bother. Come to Paris and watch me make a film." And so I did. I was doing a master's at Warwick at this point in philosophy, and during reading week, put my books in a bag and went to Paris and watched him shoot La Fidelité, his penultimate film. And then after that, I helped to get Possession, the director's cut of Possession, because it had been cut quite drastically in the States. I helped to get that released in the US. And this point, I didn't quite know what to do after my master's. I was working as a laboratory technician in Hull. And then he said, well, why don't you come to Poland? And so he wrote a letter of recommendation for a postgraduate scholarship. So I went to Warsaw, and that was very interesting. And after that scholarship came to an end, I sort of fell into this position of a sort of de facto assistant to Żuławski, because every time there was a question about film prints or rights, he would send them to me. And And then DVD started to happen. We did a commentary for Possession, and so I often got asked to film interviews, and then the subtitles. He wanted to rewrite the subtitles, so he needed a native speaker, so I fell into that role. And he kept telling everyone he was not involved in cinema, but he was still writing scripts. So he was not the kind of person who collaborated, but at the same time, I got put in this role as like a sounding board, and he wanted my opinion. So he could play good cop, bad cop with producers, basically. He would behave like a diva, and then I would go in and, that was the game. And that continued. And the last year of his life, I did the English subtitles for Cosmos, which ironically was his last film, based on the final book by Witold Gombrowicz. So there's a nice circle there. So we got through that, and it was very nice to go to Locarno Festival, and he bought me a bottle of champagne, which we shared the night with the cast and crew who were there after the premiere. And then unfortunately he got very sick, and everything had to stop. And so the last couple of months of his life, I'd applied for funds to restore and re-release his banned Polish films, The Devil and On the Silver Globe. So it was sort of this mad rush overseeing these. And in true Żuławski fashion, he died on the same night I was, the hours before I was to fly to New York to premiere these titles. So it was very, very much like one of his films, very intense. And it's not necessarily pleasant looking back at that period. I think even he would be surprised with the reception these films have got, particularly on the Silver Globe. So that really was the case. The adventure with Żuławski, let's say.
And then there is another Polish director, as mentioned, Walerian Borowczyk, a very interesting figure. Started off in animation in Poland in the post-war period, moved abroad, worked in France, made a lot of very strange, strangely erotic films. So tell us a little bit about Borowczyk and how you came to basically work with his estate after his death.
It was very different because Borowczyk was a very hermetic and elusive character. He'd shut himself off pretty much. I tried to revive interest in his films with a retrospective in London at the Lux Centre. I invited him to come to London, and he initially agreed, but then he asked, "What films are you screening? What prints?" And I explained, and he said, "Those aren't my prints. They're just strips of celluloid with holes punched in them. So we need new prints." And that really planted the seed of making new copies of Borowczyk's films and getting them into distribution. And although he never lived to see it, that eventually happened in 2013, 2014, culminating in a project which I did with Michael Brook, another great kind of film writer and historian, and James White, a restoration specialist at Arrow Films. And we did a box called Camera Obscura, the Walerian Borowczyk collection. We did a crowdfunding campaign. I asked Terry Gilliam to front it to raise money for Goto L'Île d'Amour, and that worked out. And so, the films toured the world. I have that to thanks for Borowczyk. I got to go to Sao Paulo, to Kaohsiung and Taiwan. So after that, we set up a non-profit association in Paris to manage the rights on behalf of Borowczyk's widow. And she passed away a few years ago, so we managed the author's rights and some commercial rights to these short films and to Blanche through this association. So it's quite bizarre to actually to think back to watching those films at Stoke-on-Trent Film Theatre and a ratty copy of Possession, and to see how things have changed over the years to the point where now I'm dealing with the Pompidou Centre to have Renaissance and Le Jeu des Anges as part of their permanent collection, and also working with Second Sight, a UK distributor, on a HDR 4K restoration of Possession with the camera operator Andrzej Jaroszewicz.
And it's really interesting to hear how through this kind of gateway drug figure of Żuławski, from the very beginning, you're immediately, even when you're just trying to kind of talk about or talk to or explore these figures in this work, you're immediately in the world of restoration, distribution, screening. Like you're immediately drawn into the kind of practical side of maintaining these reputations in these films from the word go. And like you say, that's because these corners of film history were pretty neglected at the time. I mean, I think now, obviously, with the internet and with the various streaming platforms and the many kind of DVD labels that are out there now, there's a kind of presumption of access and of restoration to all these different kind of corners of film history. But at the time, as the story you've just told there lays out, I mean, that wasn't the case. So to be interested in it in that way was necessarily to kind of be drawn immediately into the realm of restoration and distribution and so on.
Well, I don't. It's very nice to be approached, and it's very nice to be considered a restoration specialist, but I'm really not. Someone like James White is a restoration specialist. My role, day in, day out, it's writing, and I consider everything else a facet of writing. So in the case of restoration, it's really curation, and the idea of why this film, not that film. If you want to screen this film, you have to get it, licensed, find the materials, digitized, and in some cases restored. So I always see it as a facet of writing in the way that I don't, it's not, that's not my area. And it's the same with like documentary filmmaking. It's like, everyone can film anything these days. It's whether you record them audio or if you film them. It's about choosing a subject and then giving it form, whether it's through editing text or whether it's compiling a film program or a retrospective or creating an exhibition or an installation or editing film material. So I don't see these as separate things in my head. It makes perfect sense. I mean, if you could write about a film, or you could simply get it restored. When I was a teenager, it was the 1990s, and this is really between two revolutions. The first revolution, of course, is the collapse of what was the Soviet Union, and then the other revolution is the transition from analog culture to digital. And I think that I found myself working between those two revolutions, mainly being involved in this digitization of analog culture from countries in the Eastern Bloc, the former Soviet Union.
So going back to the life adventures of a young Dan Bird, you're living in Warsaw after this fateful encounter with Żuławski, and you start to travel more around the former Eastern Bloc, the post-Soviet states of Europe and the Caucasus. And in the Caucasus, or I mean, you tell me, maybe beforehand, there's another fateful encounter, which is with Sergei Parajanov, or the works of Sergei Parajanov. Unfortunately, you didn't get to meet him personally. So could you tell us about Parajanov and your immersion into the world of another maverick, radical, neglected genius of Eastern European film?
In the case of Parajanov, when I started studying at Warsaw, I got into a relationship with a Polish singer and dancer whose background was Ukrainian philology, and she spent a lot of time doing kind of like not anthropological work, but going to Hutzl-Chizna, which is the Carpathian Mountains between Poland and Ukraine, where Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors by Parajanov was shot. And she knew many of the singers who were involved in the film, and she knew the songs. Wow. And so we were going there a lot. And I published a book, and I wanted to do another book. And I thought, okay, there was a series on classics of Soviet cinema. So I proposed a monograph on Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors. And the editor, Richard Taylor, he said, well, look, if we're going to include a film book in this series, it has to be The Color of Pomegranates. And my first thought was, well, I knew nothing about, I love the film, but I don't know anything where to even start with that. And so I met at a festival in Slovakia, Don Askarian, a Armenian filmmaker based in Germany, and his partner was Nune Hovhannisyan, who's the daughter of Bagrat Hovhannisyan, a very good and interesting Armenian filmmaker, very underrated, ripe for rediscovery. He was also the literary editor for The Color of Pomegranates. He also appears as one of the scientists during the interrogation sequence at the beginning of Solaris. He's the king that comes at the end of Andrei Rublev, very close to Tarkovsky. And so between them, Nune and Don basically provided me with a range of people to meet if I were to travel to Yerevan in Armenia. And that was the start of my adventures, certainly in Armenia and later Georgia, and more recently Azerbaijan. It's really interesting to go from this period of being an observer, like on those initial meetings, and seeing a country, going to a museum, to then interviewing people, meeting people, going to studios, going to archives, and then suddenly, all these years down the line, being an active participant, working with ministries of culture, working with heads of archives, and working with technicians to get these films back into distribution, get them restored. Yeah, it's like just in the case of Żuławski and Borowczyk, I mean, it's the circle has fully turned to the point where the other film, which will be presented at Bologna this year, is as restoration of Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, which was from a print which had been given to me, which I had scanned in Warsaw, and I donated the print to the Austrian Film Museum. It's very interesting to be thinking about these things now, because it does feel like, going full circle in the way that I'm very glad that the interests have stayed consistent over the years. It's just slightly surreal to think about 20 years ago, thinking about going to Hutzolchizna to try and see where they shot Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, and then to be in this position now working with Bologna on a restoration, and the Dovzhenko Center in Kiev, and digitizing their archive. So it's exciting, but also strange.
I mean, just the story there of your entrance into the world of Parajanov, right, via Carpathian Ukraine and the Hutsuls, who are the people at the heart of Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, already tells us what I think is one of the key things about Parajanov, right, which is that he's a transnational filmmaker. He's born in Tbilisi to an Armenian family. He moves to Kiev, marries a Ukrainian, works with the Hutsuls, moves back to the Caucasus, and then becomes this kind of pan-Caucasian auteur. He's almost like he was ticking off the kind of the folklores and traditions of the different Caucasian countries, with Colors of Pomegranates, Ashik Karib, Legend of Suram Fortress. So, turning that into a question to you, what are the particular challenges or interesting things with an artist like Parajanov when it comes to dealing with an artist who was transnational, but in a region now where national distinctions, to put it euphemistically, are much more in effect?
Well, I didn't go there as a curator. I went there simply to try and understand the work, and I think that's it's an interesting thing with Parajanov's work. You can either appreciate it purely on an aesthetic level; it's so rich and complex, or you can ask, what does it mean? And of course, there are no definitive answers. That's why it's a great artwork. It sort of retains its mystery, so to speak. But those are the questions I wanted answers for, at least for myself. So when I went there, to simplify matters, when I went to Armenia, it was who is Parajanov? And well, his parents are Armenian, so he's Armenian. You go to Georgia. Well, he was born in Tbilisi, and he made two of his best films in Georgia, so he's really Georgian. And you go to Ukraine. Well, he was an employee of Doshenko Studio, and his wife was Ukrainian, and so yeah, he's really Ukrainian. And then you go to Moscow, and they go, well, he was a Soviet filmmaker, so he's really Russian. And I think this fascinated me because obviously during the Soviet time, he was persecuted really for perceived nationalism. There is this idea that he was persecuted for being gay. And this actually, I think this says more about our mindset, both in the 70s and everything else. His 4 charges, in as much as I remember them, were stealing icons, dealing in foreign currency, spreading venereal diseases, and inciting suicide. So, but the reason why, as we know from subsequent archival research, is that Parajanov's house, an open house in Tbilisi, had become the sort of a focal point for what was perceived to be the Ukrainian national movement in the late 1960s. And it was simply because Parajanov, his personality, when his friends from Ukraine came, they all came to his house. And of course, he was very much actively involved with the intelligentsia, with artists, in Kiev. So from the KGB point of view, he was the figurehead, let's say, the ringleader of this problem, which was a problem then as it is a problem now. But the reasons why he spent so much time in labor camps, not in Siberia, but in Ukraine during the 1970s, were complex and very ugly. And I think it's our duty to be true to the complexity of the reasons. And our first point of call is archival research, the documents, rather than speculation. And I think that there is a desire to see these films as authentic folklore, which was brutally suppressed by it. And the interesting thing about Parajanov, particularly in the case of, in the case of Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, he later came to criticize his own film in a speech he gave in Minsk. He called it a colonial film, and which is interesting. He recognized himself in an Armenian from Georgia making a film about not just Ukrainian, but Hutsal culture. So he dismissed his own film as colonial. And I think the other aspect of The Color of Pomegranates is that Parajanov made up a lot of the rituals which were perceived as being authentic. Right. He did not speak Armenian. He may have spoke colloquial Armenian, but his working language in all of his films was Russian. And so one of the motivating factors for making The Color of Pomegranates is because he wanted to discover his culture. The film was shot, yes, it was shot in Armenia. It was also shot in Georgia. There are scenes which were shot in Azerbaijan. And then on top of it, in addition to the countries, these of the Caucasus, there was studio work shot in Ukraine, and the film was re-edited in Moscow. So it is a product of the Soviet era. And I think what's fascinating now is this, just in the post-Soviet period. So when I arrived physically in the 90s, it was this moment when people are trying to reconstruct national identities. And Parajanov, who died in between the fall of the wall and the disintegration of the Soviet Union, far from being this sort of persecuted figure, became a sort of a symbol for Ukraine, a symbol for Georgia, a symbol for Armenia, and then really being thrown in the middle of this fight over the ownership, the legal ownership of the material and the material ownership. So, there is a very colonial approach to this in the way that films which were made by films within the Soviet Union, the negatives went to Gosfilmofond. So the Goskino, the Central Filmmaking Committee,
in
for
Moscow.
Distribution in Moscow, for distribution within the Soviet Union and ultimately abroad. And then the negatives were deposited in Gosfilmofond, the National Film Archive. So after the collapse, the distribution rights reverted to the countries which had the studios which made
but
the
all
films.
the materials were stuck in Moscow.
So the materials are stuck in Moscow, which is why this project for me is so interesting. Because and Ukraine is a perfect example of this, given the fact that what underpins the war in Ukraine is this idea that Russian and Ukrainian is one culture. Therefore, it is essential, absolutely imperative that everything which basically is unique and which counters this argument is both preserved and also celebrated. So, of course, the fact that the negatives are in Russia and you can't legally get them out because as a foreign institution, you can't legally deal because of the war with an official institution. But it does present a problem for kind of distributing and reclaiming and understanding Ukrainian cinema. So it's necessary to find other ways, work with other materials, and it's been a privilege to work with colleagues at Dovzhenko Center primarily, but also in Bologna, especially in Poland, with the partners of the project I work with, to basically digitize this material. And I think these questions are fascinating, and I think that as much as I love Parajanov cinema, I do think that in terms of engaging with the institutions, the people who work with those institutions, visiting these places, this is much more exciting and it's much more interesting because suddenly you're thrust into the world of politics and into art history and into all sorts of music traditions, food, wine. I mean, these are important parts of the films. I mean, particularly the color of pomegranates. I mean, you could have a huge, wonderful meal just copying the foods in that film. And, wine serves a really important part, wine production. And also the final scene of the film, it's about capturing the songs of Saint Nova, the national poet, in the kind of the wine jars, which are kind of cemented into the walls. So the best part of 20 years trying to unravel these films, particularly The Color of Pomegranates. The first thing is I'm still no closer to making sense of the film. But on the other hand, it's been a pretext to visit the Caucasus. It's been a wonderful opportunity to meet so many people, to travel and to eat and drink.
What you're saying there, I'd never heard that comment that Parajanov described Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors as a colonial film. I find that so interesting because he occupies such an interesting place in Ukraine, doesn't he? Because that film came out in 1965 and it was so important for this nascent, burgeoning movement in the Ukrainian kind of artistic intelligentsia towards a kind of re-establishment of a national identity. And then in the second half of the 60s, you get this movement, Ukrainian poetic cinema, made by Ukrainians, but they're so influenced by this film, Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, which was made by this Caucasian filmmaker in the Hutzul region, who I now learn later disowned it as colonial. So it's a great example of basically the lack of purity in the national idea, even when that idea is kind of super vibrant and producing incredibly kind of powerful and influential works.
Well, I think, to be fair, I think from my interpretation of that line is that I think it was for him, it was a very definite artistic break between Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors and the work which came afterwards, namely the short film Kiev Frescoes, which in many ways is a blueprint for the stylistic form of The Color of Pomegranates. Right. So I think there's that element to contend with. But there's also, this feeds and reflects very much the discourse we have today about, whether someone outside of a culture can, represent it, which is an interesting thing to have. On the other hand, I agree with you completely. It's an absurd thing to say, given what he gave to Ukrainian cinema, namely confidence and founded inadvertently a movement in itself, which I think also has a bearing on debate today, in the idea that, I do think, on the one hand, I fully understand the arguments. On the other hand, I think there's always a risk of cultural isolation. If Parajanov literally crossed borders. Sayat Nova, the figure which dominates the color of pomegranates, was a troubadour who traveled all around the Caucasus, Georgia and to Azerbaijan, and most of the poems which he wrote, the biggest proportion, are actually in Ottoman Turkish, translated into Armenian. And there's a key moment in the film in which the same line of poetry is translated into three languages, reflecting the three languages Sayat Nova was primarily associated with. And I think that's important not to forget in these particular moments and times about, cultural exchange and things like that. But I completely agree. I mean, Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, I think, is widely regarded as one of the key, if not the key, film in Ukrainian cinema. In my opinion, it connects with this poetic tradition of the 1920s, figures like Dovzhenko, films like Earth. But at the same time, it really is the template for films like The Stone Cross by Leonid Oseka, Yuri Ilyenko's films. And Ilyenko, of course, was the cinematographer on Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors. I think the other aspect which I do find fascinating, and this is something which really became apparent visiting Podsolchizna, is how Parajanov invented rituals which have subsequently been absorbed and adopted by the people he was representing. So
a total feedback loop, film into life.
It's a total feedback.
And back again.
Exactly. Totally. And I think and I see this with the color of pomegranates, people sort of seeing that this is some sort of authentic ritual. When, of course, and I think what's fascinating about this is it says more about us in terms of our desire for authenticity, and I think that's what's fascinating, the desire we have for authenticity, whereas basically Parajanov is arguably exoticizing culture, which is the idea of, which is fascinating given the context of the Biennale in Sydney and the Biennale in Venice. The idea that we're celebrating work in which purposefully exoticizes the Caucasus, and it's presented because we want to see it as authentic. So, but hopefully, and I think the whole point was to kind of draw you in and ask questions about how this came about, because that's my story. I mean, that's what I've been doing this last 20 years. I've been drawn in trying to answer questions, whether it's about Borovchik, whether it's about Żuławski, whether it's about Makeveev, whether it's about Alexei German, Larissa Shebitka, Kira Muratova, Ardakin Mikulov, Yuri Akubisko, Vera Hitilova, Jan Nemets, really people who have intrigued me, fascinated me. And the reason I'm still interested in these people is because I don't know the answers. When you know something, you can move on to the next thing. This is the content culture we live in, and the idea that, once you've seen something, you don't need to go back to it. You go on to the next thing, the next episode, the next series.
Well, Dan Bird, thanks so much for taking us on this adventure through your encounters with all these figures in Eastern Europe and the Caucasus. And thanks as well for all the work you've done to help preserve and share and champion all those filmmakers that you've listed.
Well, I should add. Well, thank you for inviting me to be on the podcast. But it's also that Klassiki, in its various different iterations and forms, has been a partner on many of these projects right from the beginning. I mean, a supporter of Hakopov Natanyan, one of these Parajanov shorts, and also raising money for the restoration of Maria Sakyan's Mayak, or the lighthouse, and also funding the restoration of Zhetan, the Azerbaijani short animation. So it's it's a pleasure to be involved with like-minded people who have equally fantastic taste in cinema.
And since you've presented me with the opportunity, I will just mention, if you'd like to watch Zhietan, wonderful Azerbaijani animated short that Dan was involved in the restoration of, or indeed Hakapov and Tanyan, the Parajanov short, then they are available to watch on Klassiki now. But Dan Bird, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Thanks, Sam.